The fire that began in Hiroshima didn't die. It moved. It changed its form, its methods, and its justifications. By the dawn of the 21st century, it no longer burned in mushroom clouds or vaporized cities. It burned in speeches, on satellite feeds, and in the invisible lines between truth and belief. The battlefield had evolved, but the moral illusion remained the same. In 1991, the world watched the first Gulf War unfold not through telegrams or newspapers, but on glowing television screens. It was the first live war, the CNN War. Images of precision bombs lighting up the Baghdad skyline filled living rooms across the West. War was no longer distant, chaotic, and human. It became a spectacle, surgical, clean, and justified. The narrative was clear. Iraq had invaded Kuwait. Saddam Hussein, the brutal dictator, threatened world peace. The United States, with a coalition of nations, stood as the defender of order, democracy, and morality. For a brief moment, the world believed. Operation Desert Storm was hailed as a triumph of technology and restraint. Smart bombs, guided missiles, satellite targeting, all promised a new kind of war, humane, efficient, moral. But the reality on the ground was far less clinical. Thousands of civilians were killed, their homes destroyed, their futures erased in the name of precision. When the war ended, Saddam remained in power, Iraq was shattered, and the seeds of future chaos were planted deep. The New World Order President George H.W. Bush promised never truly came. It simply waited. 12 years later, that waiting turned to obsession. September 11, 2001. The skyline of New York burned, the Twin Towers fell, and with them, the illusion of invulnerability. In the smoke and grief, America's heart demanded justice and vengeance. But the enemy was no longer a nation, it was an idea, and ideas cannot be bombed into silence. Still, the drums of war began to beat again, this time under a familiar moral banner: protection, freedom, necessity. President George W. Bush spoke of an axis of evil. His advisors whispered of secret labs in the Iraqi desert, of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, biological, ready to strike the world. The narrative was irresistible. Once again, America stood not as a conqueror, but as a savior. Once again, a war was wrapped in the language of peace. In March 2003, the invasion of Iraq began. Shock and awe. The phrase itself was a masterpiece of psychological theater. For 48 hours, Baghdad glowed under relentless bombardment. The world watched in high definition as the sky turned orange and night became day. But what followed was not liberation. It was the slow unraveling of a nation. The weapons of mass destruction were never found. The evidence so confidently presented to the United Nations with diagrams and satellite images was built on fragments, rumors, and lies. It wasn't the absence of morality that drove the war, but its imitation. The invasion toppled Saddam Hussein, but it also dismantled Iraq's institutions, its army, its fragile balance of power. The vacuum left behind was soon filled with insurgency, extremism, and civil war. Cities became battlegrounds, ancient cultures crumbled, the promise of democracy turned into the reality of chaos, and in the distance, safe behind their screens, the world continued to watch. What makes the Iraq War uniquely tragic is not just the destruction it caused, but the certainty with which it was justified. Every war crime began as a moral argument. Every invasion began with the claim that it was necessary. The United States didn't see itself as a new empire. It saw itself as the last hope. And perhaps that belief was the most dangerous weapon of all. For when a nation convinces itself that its violence is virtue, there are no limits to what it can do. The war's architects spoke of democracy as if it were a product to be installed, a system to be exported. They believed that fear could be erased by force, that nations could be rebuilt by bombs, that morality could be measured in tonnage. But the fire they lit in Baghdad spread far beyond Iraq's borders. Out of the ruins rose a generation shaped by occupation and anger. Al-Qaeda in Iraq became ISIS. Cities once known for their culture, Mosul, Fallujah, Ramadi, became names whispered in horror. And the West, having promised liberation, found itself facing a war without end. The cycle had returned, modernized, digitized, but unchanged in its essence. There is a line that runs from Hiroshima to Baghdad. It is not a line of technology, but of justification. In 1945, the world was told that nuclear fire would save lives. In 2003, it was told that preemptive war would preserve peace. Both times the reasoning was the same: destruction as salvation. But morality built on convenience is not morality, it is theater. The Iraq War exposed something deeper than political failure. It revealed a spiritual one. It showed how a nation that once saw itself as the world's conscience could become blinded by its own righteousness. Even as the truth began to unravel, the machinery of justification kept turning. Politicians defended their lies. Media amplified fear. Corporations profited from rebuilding what had been destroyed. And beneath it all, the human cost, the lives buried in unmarked graves, the children who grew up among ruins, was quietly erased from the narrative. The images of burning tanks and cheering crowds faded, but the wounds remained, invisible and unhealed. Years later, when questioned about the war, President Bush said he had no regrets. "History will judge," he said. But history has already judged. It judges not in textbooks or speeches, but in the silence of those who lived through the consequences. An Iraqi mother once said, "They came to free us, but we buried our freedom with our sons." Her voice never made the evening news. In America, the war became background noise, another headline, another statistic. For the soldiers who fought it and the civilians who endured it, the moral clarity of 2003 dissolved into confusion and loss. And somewhere in the deserts of Iraq, amid the rubble and dust, the echoes of Hiroshima returned. Different weapons, same logic. Different enemies, same righteousness. The tragedy of Iraq is not that it happened, but that it was inevitable. When nations forget the lessons of their own history, they are doomed to reenact them, this time with better cameras and stronger slogans. The story of the Iraq War is not only about deception, it is about belief. The belief that good intentions can excuse catastrophe. The belief that power, when used for the right reasons, is somehow purified. But no amount of moral vocabulary can disguise what war truly is: the organized destruction of human lives for political ends. The great irony is that the same country that once warned the world about the dangers of unchecked power became the very embodiment of it. And as the decades passed, that contradiction hardened into silence. Today, Iraq is a scar, a reminder of what happens when conscience becomes a weapon. The age of atomic bombs was replaced by an age of algorithms. But the logic behind them remains identical: precision without responsibility, action without consequence, control without compassion. From Hiroshima to Baghdad, the pattern is clear. When nations claim moral superiority, their wars become righteous, their destruction becomes necessary, and their victims become invisible. The fire of Hiroshima was supposed to end all wars. Instead, it became the model for how to justify them. Each time the world promises never again, it simply learns to kill differently. And so, the story continues, not with the flash of light, but with the quiet hum of drones over foreign skies, guided by coordinates detached from faces. The weapons no longer need pilots. The wars no longer need declarations. All they need is belief. The lesson of Iraq is not about one country or one war. It is about the human tendency to mistake conviction for truth, to believe that righteousness justifies ruin. When Hiroshima burned, the world said, "Never again." When Baghdad burned, the world said, "We had no choice." What will we say next time? The fire that began in 1945 still burns. It just changed color. And somewhere in the quiet of another government office, another leader is being handed another report, stamped urgent, filled with warnings and intelligence, and ending with the same timeless justification: it's necessary. Thank you for watching. If this story made you think, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the complex events that shape our world. See you next time.